Welcome to episode 2 of Signal Flow. This is a show all about the people behind the pro audio companies. And this is a little bit different than working class audio in the sense that all the light is shine on those individuals who work at companies or with companies. And today's guest is Dave Godowsky. Dave runs an artist relations company, and that's a company that essentially works with pro audio companies to interface with producers, engineers, and artists. And Dave is going to educate us about everything that he does and what's involved with that. So I hope you enjoy. Let's talk to Dave Godowsky. Dave Godowsky, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with, where are we at today? What do you consider yourself today? And what is your day-to-day life like? And then we'll start to dig into the past a bit.
Cool. So my job today, my role in the industry is strictly artist relations, which is basically I founded my own artist relations company where I am the bridge between the artists who make music and the companies who make all the gear that they use to make music. And so those two worlds interact in all different ways, and it gets very complicated, and it needs someone to navigate it for that bridge to be strong and healthy, which I actually think is critical, not just for the artists and for the companies, but for music itself, because I've seen, that manifest itself in terms of actual records getting made.
Is artist relations, I'm assuming you would say yes, but is it a necessary thing for every company in the world of pro audio?
I think it's a necessary thing for any company where your customers are artists. I think it's probably the number one, tenet of business. Like the number one thing in any industry is to know your customer. And so if you're a company if all your customers are people who are trying to make music, they're artists. Like that's, if your products are used to create art, then all your customers are artists and aspire to be artists. So yeah, I would think in order for them to know their customers, they have to know the artist community. They have to be in touch with artists. They have to be incorporating artists' insights into everything that they're doing.
What does the role of artist relations look like, just from a very simplified explanation of like what is it you're doing?
Sure. So there's a few different ways that artist relations works, and it really has to do with what parts of the business they're helping. Because if you look at one single business, there can be a marketing department, a brand department, biz dev, product and product development. There's lots of different areas of the business that rely on artists to be able to do their jobs effectively. So it really is a matter of connecting with the artist community and finding the right people to talk to and the right way to connect them to the right parts of the company to sort of drive value into all those different areas. And then there's another sort of pillar of artist relations, which is simply word of mouth. And some people might put that into one of those other existing areas of a business, but it never quite fits into one conveniently. It really is just its own thing. And the basic, 30-second description of it is just, there's a big pyramid of customers or users. At the bottom, you have millions of potential customers. And at the top is this sort of top tier of artists and producers and engineers who just have the most influence. They have the most eyes on them. And when they use something, eventually it just has a ripple effect to the entire base community. So in that regard, the job of artist relations is to know everyone at the top of that pyramid and hopefully, show them what the company's doing and what they're all about.
And that is a role you and I have discussed this separately, but that's a role that kind of works not necessarily hand in hand, right? But closely with the marketing department.
Yeah. Excuse me. Definitely. There's some people just view it as marketing, which, I wouldn't say that it's not marketing. It's just, it gets complicated because ultimately artist relations is relationships. That's part of the name. Like they're actual human relationships. And so to work effectively, they should just be, in its truest form, they're friendships. They're real human relationships. So when you try to force them into certain corporate boundaries or policies and ways of working that might work for other conventional departments of a business like marketing, sometimes it gets a little tricky. It gets a little weird. And I think companies wonder why. It's just a common thing I've heard at so many different companies. People struggle with artist relations. And usually I find that they're operating their artist relations the same way they're running every other function of a business. And if you think about it and just, take a time out and stop thinking about the actual operations of the business and just look at the reality of it, they're treating human relationships the same way they are other business functions, which doesn't really make sense, especially when the people on the other end are artists and they're people who have absolutely, they have absolutely no concept nor care of how the business is being run. They just make music.
You have formed an independent company that works for various companies or is employed by various companies, but is not directly a department of any of those companies. Is that accurate?
Right, right. It's an independent company, and then I have several businesses that are clients where I handle their artist relations independently.
Your involvement in music is very varied, and it's part business, it's part musician and creator. Can you talk a little bit about the journey to get here?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I started off just as a musician, as a songwriter, and when I was very young, swore that was all I was going to do. That was all I was good at, all I was interested in, and then just quickly learned the reality, even just financially. I was broke within a few months, and I found myself wondering how other people do it. How other people can pay the rent and pay like student loan payments and buy a car and do all these things just by making music. So, it depends who you ask, but there's a lot of different answers to that question. But that's how I found myself getting into the music industry is I was just a musician. So if I couldn't do it from making music, I figured, well, I'll find a job helping other people do it. And that got me into managing my friend's band, who at the time it was almost like a joke or something. It was just, we were really young and I was like, why not? Yeah, I'll be the manager. But it ended up like taking off and yeah.
Is that a difficult position for you personally to be in because you're sacrificing what your ultimate goal was to be a musician and then to take a sidestep, over and help others. Does that affect you at all in the negative?
I think it did when I was younger. It doesn't anymore at all. But when I was first starting off, there was definitely, and I think part of it was because I was working as a manager and I was working at labels doing A&R. So it sort of felt like I was like the cop at the party or something. Like if I was hanging out with a bunch of musicians, it almost felt like because I worked at a label, I wasn't supposed to be there, or I was sort of looked at differently. Which was kind of a tough pill to swallow because I was a musician and a songwriter just like everyone else. I just had to get a job, it didn't change who I was or anything. So it did feel like, I don't know, it just kind of sad. But I think things have changed since then a lot, especially since I left that side of the industry and came over to the side of, working with the companies that make all the tools and the gear and everything. And now all that is, all that bummer stuff is gone, thankfully.
Yeah. You're no longer seen as an interloper.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your time at record labels, did you enjoy that at all?
I did. Yeah. I mean, I got to do a lot of great things. I got to work with a lot of artists who I became really close friends with, and I'm still really close with. I got to sign some amazing talent. Yeah, I mean, I signed, artists new and old. Like there were people like Nathaniel Rateliff, where it was, he was one that I discovered and signed when he was playing for just a handful of people a night. And then there were artists like Ween, who I signed, and they had already gone through multiple labels and stuff. That's a much different type of signing. And I got to work with back catalogs of artists like John Fahey and Loudon Wainwright, of just calling their catalog to put together compilations. That was kind of fun. And then, yeah, managing artists is a whole other thing. Obviously much, much different job. And there's good and bad things about that too.
Have you ever been in the business of managing producers, engineers, mixers?
Yes, I managed a couple, Chris Shaw and Paul Coldery.
Artist management, producer engineer management, A&R. I mean, it's like you're doing a sample tour of all the roles.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I was doing too. I mean, I think I was just trying to find a vocation in music that I enjoyed and felt like I was really contributing something, and nothing ever quite felt right. I was always grateful to have jobs in music. I mean, even at its worst, it was still something I was grateful for, but it still just didn't feel right. Honestly, until like now. I can honestly say, like, this new company that I just started myself, it feels like all of it, this is the culmination of all of it, and it makes me not regret any of it, because it feels like everything was leading up to this, and like the end justifies the means.
How did you find yourself in the world of pro audio? Because you do have a history with some of the companies you now represent. Where did you go from, and where did you go to when it came time to, transition to the world of pro audio? Were you still working at labels or managing artists or producers?
I was managing artists and producers. I was managing a bunch of different artists. It was Against Me, Speedy Ortiz, Cass McCombs, Martha Wainwright, Field Report, Ockerville River. It was a bunch of different folks. And yeah, I think I sort of just hit the point where I burnt out. It was just too much work. And yeah, I just wanted something else. And I had always used isotope plugins because, even though 21-year-old me may have moved on from being a professional songwriter, I still did it. I've been writing and recording music constantly to this day. And I use all these, all the isotope plugins. I didn't really know a whole lot about that side of the industry at the time. So I had a friend who worked at Isotope who came to me and said that they were looking for someone to bring on board to help with, different aspects of what they were doing with artist relations and this and that. And I sort of stopped and was like, artist relations? Yeah, like, who's talking to all these artists and producers and everything? Who's connecting the dots between your company and that whole? And he was like, well, exactly. Yeah, there isn't really anyone doing that. And this was like a light bulb went off of like, oh my God, that would be a really cool job. So I went there and started doing that, just artist and industry relations for Isotope. And that was the first kind of foot in the door of that industry. That was in like 2017.
Your decision making in like going through all these different roles, was any of it tied to lifestyle? I know you have a family. I don't know if you had family at this point. What was driving your decisions about where you wanted to go? Getting paid and being able to pay the bills is a factor, but it's not the only factor.
I don't think money was ever a factor. I mean, if money's a factor, you're probably not working in music at all. I think the biggest factor was just sort of, part of it is just kind of gut instinct. Just when things don't feel right, I'd move on, and not being afraid to do that. Like if something's just not feeling right, if you're not feeling fulfilled, to just explore other options. I've always just been interested in different things in music too. So I like the idea of starting over and exploring new things and taking chances. And so part of it is that. The biggest thing though is probably, I remember really early on in my career, I was probably like, I don't know, 23 3 years old or something. I was working at Rounder Records, and there was some sort of, I can't even remember what it was. There was some dispute that came up between the band and the label. And I kind of didn't know whose side to be on. I didn't know if I was supposed to be, it was the band that I signed, but I also worked for the label and I was very young. And I remember going to someone who I was close friends with and I trusted at the label for advice, this guy, Jim Horan. And he said, the most important thing is your relationships with the artists. Like, ultimately, you're probably going to have a lot of jobs. You're going to do a lot of different things. But like, if you do it right, those relationships are going to transcend all of it. And they're probably going to be with you for your whole career. So don't mess those up. And he wasn't suggesting that I like do anything bad at the label or anything. It's just to make sure that, take care of those relationships first. And it hadn't really, I don't know, for some reason it really resonated with me. And I think it really stuck with me. And I kind of, in a way, it kind of guided my whole professional career from that point on. It's just the value of relationships.
That's a tough position to be in A&R.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. It's your job. You're working for the label, but it's also your job to advocate for the artist because you're the artist's internal cheerleader. I definitely almost got myself fired multiple times for advocating for Nathaniel Rateliff. I remember that because for a long time he really struggled. And I remember just being really frustrated because I felt like he had so much potential and he was so talented and he should have been so much bigger. I know everyone always says that about lots of people, but I really felt it with him. And so, yeah, I mean, I would just go as far as I could push it without getting myself fired. And then when he finally broke out and got successful, it was like, it felt so good just for me personally, just a sort of validation. And of course, like all A&R people, by the way, we love to talk about those stories and we conveniently don't talk about all the things that didn't work out.
Well, and A&R people, like their approval rating in life, is somewhere hovering just around maybe a little above attorneys.
Yeah.
They're not well regarded. So that it is a tough position to be in.
I see why. It's kind of a hard job. And for a while it was really sort of a coveted job. I don't know if it is anymore. Like, do people still really want to be A&R people the way they used to?
I don't know. And, something that I've heard from people that I've talked to is that the younger generation of A&R is not as music driven. They're more analytics driven. They're more social media numbers driven. And it's a different, they're very algorithm driven and not so much like, man, I really love this band. I think this could go somewhere. We should develop this.
Yeah, I don't think it's their fault entirely. I think a big part of that, I think, is why I stopped managing artists back in 2017 or 2018, whenever that was, was that I could kind of see the writing on the wall because it's not just the A&R people, it was just the whole industry. I didn't quite know what to do anymore, or I didn't recognize my surroundings. Like I got into it because I just love albums. And I love like a really great album and the idea of someone or a group of musicians or a songwriter and a producer people coming together and creating this amazing piece of work. I was just obsessed with great albums. And so when that was the whole industry, it was all about making and releasing the album. And it still is in a sense, but, not quite to the same extent that it used to be. And when things sort of started to steer over towards content more and more, I guess I just found myself a little disillusioned. And that's kind of why I left it. Although that's not to say that I think there's more great music being made today than ever. So, don't get me wrong. It's not about good music. That hasn't changed. There's always great music. That's never going to change. It was more about the format and the process and the way we listen to it and what we do with it, the role of the album culturally, things like that changed.
So let's come back to the time at Isotope. Eventually, you got to a point where essentially Isotope was bought, Native Instruments, Plug-in Alliance, and Isotope. Didn't they all become one company?
Yeah. Yep. They all got acquired by the same private equity firm.
And so essentially, did that change your role overnight because then you had these two other companies?
Yeah, it kind of did, but in a good way, because I loved Native Instruments and I loved Plug-in Alliance. So when I heard that we were all coming together, my first thought was just like, oh, do I get to rep them too? Like I spend all day talking to people about Isotope. I'd love to talk to people about those companies too. Everyone loves their stuff. Everyone uses that stuff. There's so many, I immediately had like thousands of ideas. So I basically just ended up taking over that role of artist relations for Native and Plug-in Alliance too. So from my point of view, it was just great.
What transpired to get us from you're working for those companies to creating your own company?
Yeah. So as much as I loved all three of those companies and working there and everything, which I really did and do, I was also thinking about growing my own career. And it's sort of a tricky position to be in where you want to grow your career, but you don't necessarily want to be promoted. Most other people at other businesses want to be promoted. Like you want to work your way up. And I like doing what I do. I want to develop my career, but so if you're not going to go up, the only other direction is out, is like wide. You can go deeper or you can go wider. So I wanted to go wider, keep doing the same thing I'm doing, but instead of just doing it for Isotope and Native Instruments and Plug-in Alliance, add more brands and do it independently. It made sense to me. I actually thought it would be even more effective because I think, like we were talking about before, artist relations by its nature functions best when it's sort of just its own independent thing, as opposed to being like a function of a corporate function of the business. But I didn't know how the company would take it. I was to be honest, I was preparing myself for them to say like, okay, cool, Dave, see you later. But they were really great about it. And they were like, that sounds like a great idea. And we'd love to come along and be your first clients. So it was awesome. I was thrilled. And so, yeah, I did that. And then it was a great way to start the business.
Just curious, from their perspective, they maintain, they stay connected to the talent that you are. And I assume that, you going from a full-time employee, there's some things that they end up not having to pay for, lessen the load on them, yet they still get the benefit. Was that a little bit of a juggling act? Like, well, wait a minute, I used to get this and now.
Well, that was actually a big part of what I pitched them was, I think I have a scenario here where you could actually pay less and get more, which I think every business likes hearing that. It at least is people's ears will perk up, because it didn't bother me at all. Like, because I want to run my own business. So all things considered, I would much rather take less to be able to be empowered to move forward and grow my career.
Which, if I read through the lines, means you want autonomy.
Yeah.
Yeah. This allows you to work with the companies that you want to work with and grow that business. But it also gives you autonomy because you're contracted.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So what is the approach that you thought, okay, well, I'm going to leave. These guys are going to be my first clients. What decision-making process comes into play when acquiring new clients? Is it based on your interest of those products and those companies?
Yeah, that's one thing. I mean, even more than my interest, to be honest, it's like the people I look up to, their thoughts about everything. If all the top artists, all the most successful, respected, influential artists and producers out there love a certain company, then that makes them more appealing as a client, obviously, than the other side of the coin. So that was a big one. But then also, yeah, I mean, it's got to be someone that I want to work with, a product that I also believe in, that I feel like fits the roster well. Because there's also a bit of an issue when it comes to competition. Like there's some, you probably can't represent Pepsi and Coke. Maybe it's okay to represent Spindrift and Coke or something. There's certain areas where it seems okay. Like I think in the plugin space, it's not like people are out there only buying plugins by one company. The plugin industry is so vast. I mean, I would actually argue that it helps me do my job by sort of feeling somewhat agnostic to the plugin, being able to represent different plugin brands when I'm talking to people, as opposed to just exclusively one. But then there's other areas of the business where it might be weird to represent companies that are really directly competitors, Like if I was representing like Logic and Ableton maybe, or like Logic and Pro Tools or something. I mean, there's most people just use one, and it would be weird to be sort of representing two different DAWs maybe. I don't know if that's a good example, but
well, there's a lot of variables too. Like, if you were you represent Soyuz, but they don't make ribbon mics to the best of my knowledge.
Right.
So representing, Royer or AEA,
exactly,
or one of the other ribbon mic companies, that would be an acceptable combo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And some of it is honestly just a matter of still figuring it out. I don't claim to have all the answers about the optimal way of doing everything, but I'm paying attention and learning and trying to figure it all out as I go. So like, we'll see how, the business has only been in operation for a few months. So it's so new. It's inevitable that there's going to be learnings and changes. And so I'm as curious as anyone else to see where it all goes. I could see it growing. I could see it staying exactly the same. I'm really open to anything. I'm just trying to let it, whatever the case, I'm letting it happen organically and trying to have some purpose behind the decisions that are being made.
I don't want to try to simplify what you're doing, but is your job essentially day to day talking to people about the products that you represent and how they can help empower the artists that you're speaking to? And as far as those artists are concerned, you're trying to get more and more artists into the camp that are influential, that can have an impact on more products being sold for those companies. Is that size it up?
Yeah, I think when you sort of scale back enough, that in general is what it is. You're talking to the right people about the right things. It's pretty simple. But then if you zoom in, there's always more to it, because there's only so many hours in the day, and you want to be strategic about, who you're talking to about what, and there should be, you don't want it to be transactional, but at the same time, it's not random. So there is some sort of strategy baked in just from knowing the landscape on both sides. If you know what the products are and you know how all the artists and producers and engineers think and operate, you might naturally know what's best to talk to who about and how to say it. And I think that probably only comes from doing it long enough to kind of learn that. It's obviously not like there isn't some giant phone book with all this information somewhere.
And I'm sure that there's a certain level of trying to understand who's out there, who's doing what, who's the legacy producers, engineers, mixers, creators versus who's new, who's coming up. So it's, I'm sure that there's a bit of analyzing the broader picture of what's happening and who's the competition potentially for the companies you represent.
Yeah, that plays into it, as well as specific campaigns. There's specific things that the companies are trying to achieve. Every client I work with, there isn't like a blanket philosophy where we just sign off and I go do my thing. It's heavily tailored, and usually days, if not weeks, of a sort of diagnostic period of looking at the company, everything they've got going on across their whole business, and how artist relations can be fueling it, and then specifically how we execute those strategies. And it gets, once you get in the weeds, it does get kind of complicated. So, it's just sort of yes and no. Like, in a sense, it's all just talking to artists about music gear. But when you zoom in, there's definitely a lot of intention and strategy around who, what, why, where, when, with all of it.
And it must be difficult too to cut through a bit of the noise because, as you said, the plug-in field alone, hell, the microphone field alone is very crowded.
Yeah.
And not only are there lots of major, well-known players, but there's a lot of new, smaller boutique companies coming up doing interesting things, that are thinking outside the box a bit.
And everyone's looking for something different. Not every company has the same goals. Some people are trying to just sell more of one thing. Some people want to work with artists to create a signature product. Some people are looking to work with artists for marketing assets. Some people are looking to artists to help break into new territories, new genres, new age groups. There's so many different goals that these companies have where they end up running into a wall and they can't achieve their goals. And it's amazing how often that wall has something to do with the artist community. So a big part of it is just figuring out how to, unlock that door. I'm mixing metaphors, but how to get over that wall.
Do the companies spend a lot of time calling you and asking you questions?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we talk multiple times throughout the week about so many different things. Could be related to a product, a campaign, an event. So many different things. There's product development insights too, which we haven't even really talked about, but I think is one of the biggest parts of this whole thing is, you could have a company like Isotope, they know what they're doing. They do amazing work, but there's always going to be something to be gained from listening to the artist community. Like that's the closest thing to a crystal ball because they're not just ahead of the curve. They're the ones who kind of dictate what the curve is. So if you're closely working in lockstep with that community, that can be really contributing significantly to the functions and features of products, a company's whole biz dev department. But a lot of them don't do it for some reason. It's kind of strange.
You mean they don't do the artist outreach to try to collaborate on products?
Yeah, or just to get feedback. A lot of companies, I think they know more than they do. They might be making a product that's used to make records, and they've never made records before. And they might not know what it's like in reality to be in a studio making records all day. So again, coming back to know your customer, I think if they're smart, they'd be talking to the ones who spend all day in the studio making records to help dictate how these products should be built.
It's complex launching a product, and it takes a lot of coordination and a lot of, it's not just build it and show everybody and go, look what we did, and not address the usability of it, how to find it, how to get it, how to, who else is using it. There's so much involved.
Yeah, especially in software.
And some companies, I'm not going to name names, but I witnessed a rollout of a product recently that I was a little kind of taken aback by the lack of preparedness. And they'll figure it out, but I think it was interesting to see it and think about everything that I may be doing or may be involved in, and how to not make those same mistakes.
Wow. I'm curious to know who it is now. Anyone listening, if you Venmo Matt $100, he'll tell you who it is.
How does a person in your position in this job measure the success of your job and hold yourself accountable to those that are, basically paying you to go and be that mouthpiece? How do you hold on to your job?
I think you're touching on probably the hardest part of the job, because unlike other areas of the business, you don't really have the same success metrics. Like if you work in paid media or social media or sales, you have numbers. There's always numbers, and you can point to certain numbers that are going up and therefore you did good. In my world, there's little to no numbers. So it's difficult sometimes to show the value. Yet, if you talk to every CMO, CEO of all these companies, unanimously they'll say it's artist relations is critical, and being in the good graces of the top tier artists and producers and everyone is critical. It's just hard to show your work. It's hard to show the data. So a big part of how I try to tackle that is just coming up with our own metrics ahead of time and just setting expectations. It might be, look, we're going into this campaign. Our goal is going to be to get X number of people on board with this. We're going to reach out to this many, have meaningful conversations one-on-one with 100 people about that product. And it's going to be people who are working in this genre, because we feel that if we get enough people in that genre at that level, it'll help move the needle. And then maybe we get, there's different things that you try to check off, and then you can sort of tailor it to that specific moment with that client. But yeah, it's hard. You sort of need to force them to exist, because if you don't, there won't be any numbers. But I've also, at the same time, if I look back at all the biggest wins I've ever been part of, 10 out of 10, they're all traceable back to artist conversations. And that's another way I've been able to kind of deal with that, is saying like, okay, well, even if there are no metrics at all, look at all these things that you've achieved in the past 2 years and look how they show the source of all of them. And they'll say like, oh, right, I see. If it wasn't for all these artist conversations, that wouldn't have happened, and that wouldn't have happened, and that wouldn't have happened. So at some point, I think you need someone to kind of understand and believe that and just sign off on it.
Do you try to make it a point of capturing, whether it's screen grabs or just, whatever, of like, hey, check it out, and report back to the company, whatever company it is. So-and-so talked about us here. This is something that, my company has done, and just to show social proof to the companies that you're reporting to.
I don't really do a lot of it. I do some of it. Like whenever something happens in the moment, I might just send it over and be like, hey, check it out, But I'm also not trying to overly like hoard that stuff to validate the work. I think there's other people at the company that are probably tracking social media mentions and PR mentions and all kinds of different things. And then I'll just work with whoever I'm talking to at the company and just say, these are the things that are fueling those areas of the business.
Interesting. Now, kind of even, and I'm not asking you for specific numbers here, but how does one come to a set of numbers to talk about, like when you're negotiating to get new business? How do you show value to a microphone company or a plugin company to say, you need to pay me X amount of dollars per month for, what I do?
Yeah, it's tough because the whole spectrum is so huge. I mean, it's sort of similar to like a producer of a record. How much should a producer charge? And it's sort of like, well, it's complicated. And if you ask a producer, they usually don't say like, oh, there's my rate. It's usually like, let's talk, because there's a lot of different factors. And ultimately it's about the producer. If they're able to get the work and the amount that they're charging and the amount that people are willing to pay and be happy works for everyone, then it works, as opposed to a sort of market rate. I think the industry is way too niche for there to be any market rate around it. So it's really all just case by case.
Sizing up the company and the company's goals.
Yeah.
Because, Plugin Alliance, Native Instruments, Isotope, they're going to have different needs as compared to, say, So-Use microphones.
Yeah, and everyone's budgets are different. It's not as different as you would think. It's interesting because, the bigger companies also have exorbitant costs of all kinds that we don't always think about. Like, massive office space and massive staffs and all kinds of different costs that smaller companies don't really incur. So I think at first someone might think like, well, I mean, that company has 500 people at it. That one only has 10. Like, or they look at the numbers of how much they might gross a year or something. And it seems like, well, they should be paying 10 times what they're paying. But then you look at the actual budgets. And even if you look at those companies' marketing budgets and ad budgets, I think people would be surprised to see that they're not that different, because the expenses and the overhead that the bigger one has is so massive. The numbers all slowly start to come together a lot.
Let's talk a little bit about the artistic side of it. And, are you approaching people? Do people approach you? Like, how does that side of it work to where the the lines of communication get opened up?
You mean with artists?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes in all different ways. Sometimes I reach out to someone out of the blue. Sometimes they reach out to me out of the blue. The most common one is sort of referrals, like artist to artist referrals. And I always find those to be the best. It just feels the most natural. Again, if you just think of them as relationships, it's kind of like friendships. Like if you reached out to someone and said like, hey, you don't know me, but would you like to be friends? Like it might feel kind of weird. But if someone says, oh, hey, you should know this person. I'm putting you on a text together. You guys got to know each other. And you have a mutual friend that you both really like and trust. It's a totally different story. Even though in both cases, you're strangers getting to know each other, it makes so much of a difference to have someone else just be the conduit. So I guess over the years, I've just naturally tried to lean that way as much as possible. Or I'll, if someone is a mutual friend, I'll just ask if they're comfortable to make an intro. That's always the best way.
I want to try to identify some of the potential artists in this case. Obviously we have producers and engineers who are high profile, or, they have a presence out there, on the internet, essentially. Are content creators, YouTubers, podcasters, etc., is that also considered an artist? And as another variation of artist, are educators looked at as artists?
Yeah, I mean, they're all important. And I mean that not just in a, feel good, warm and fuzzy way, but in a business sense too, because they all have influence on the community. They all greatly affect the products and the workflows that are being adopted by the community at large in a very direct and efficient way. So it's important to work with them as best you can for all these companies. I think the word artist does have a specific meaning, someone who makes art for a living, someone who their sole source of income is making and performing and or releasing music. So I try to limit artists to people who do that. And producers and recording engineers and mix engineers and mastering engineers, they all have specific roles. A YouTube content creator, an educator, they have specific roles too. And all these people should be worked with, and the companies should be in communication with all of them. Sometimes the word artist just gets thrown out as a catch-all. I do it myself. I mean, I talk about my job as artist relations. It's also producer relations and engineer relations and all kinds of different ones. So I think it does get used as a catch-all, but I also think it's important to specify who you're talking to and what their role is and what they actually do.
And then I would also assume that you only have so much bandwidth for so many companies, because as you say, there's only so much time in the day, and the level at which you have to educate yourself with these companies and what their goals are and who the potential people to work with are. If you spread yourself too thin, you can't really do the job effectively well for the companies you have, right?
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, it's amazing how much more efficient you can be with your time with autonomy. And also, when you work at a company, there's other things that you end up doing with your time inevitably. If you manage other people, then you have all kinds of managerial time spent and administrative things, and there's things with HR, and there's meetings, and there's lots of different things that happen at the company that take little bits of your time, even just a few minutes here and there add up. So I have found that being independent and being able to focus and just work with total independence and autonomy allows me to be really efficient with my time, and I can get more done. And I can get more done when it comes to delivering the value that ultimately the clients want. Because it really there isn't always a direct correlation between time and value with what I do. I mean, there is, broadly speaking. I mean, obviously, if I spend 15 minutes on one client and 20 hours on another one, that one's going to get more, to use an extreme example. But it's also true that I could have a 15-minute conversation with the right artist, and that 15-minute conversation could end up making the client $1 million. Like, there really isn't a direct correlation. It's loose, and the most valuable way to navigate it is just intuition.
Also, you could spend, 30 minutes on a call with an artist and talk about each one of those companies and how those products are benefiting that artist and how they're able to create and do whatever they do. And that's kind of, equally spreading the time across all of your clients.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that adds to the efficiency for sure. And there's a sort of cross-pollination that happens too. Like, someone might be a fan of one company, but has actually never heard of another one. They've never used it, and vice versa. So you're able to, just cross-pollinate across the different brands, which is helpful for everyone.
And I would assume that there is a large level of enjoyment with this role because, there's the business side of it and the analytical thinking that comes with, okay, what's the strategy here and how are we going to spread the word about these products? But at the end of the day, having the conversations with artistic people and those making, music is an enjoyable thing.
It really is. I love it. And I feel like there's some stigma or there's just some trend, at least in America, especially about, if you're working hard, you must be stressed out and unhappy and angry. And, the sort of image that we get of the really hard-working individual is like head down, kind of serious. We're not having a good time. We're working, which is, I guess, is probably true in a lot of cases, but not always. Because, my job, and don't get me wrong, I work my ass off. Like, I literally get up every morning at 5 a.m. and start working. Like, I work harder than anyone I know. I also love every minute of it. It's like equal parts hard work and pure enjoyment. And it's also really fulfilling because I know I can actually see the work I'm doing transform into actual music coming out. And I'll talk to artists and producers who say, like, oh, the album comes out next week. You were so helpful about this or that, or when you sent us over this thing, we ended up using it and it sparked some inspiration, and that ended up being the sound of the song that did this. Like, whenever moments like that happen, it's like, that's just really cool. It feels good to be contributing on that level. So yeah, it feels like when it's done right, it truly is just a total win-win.
I also think what's inspirational about your particular world that you have here is that you've created a gig for yourself that you enjoy doing, that is flexible, that you can do in and around your family. And you as you alluded to it just now, I mean, you basically have a quality of life that is inspirational. And I think as a result of that, you do enjoy doing it. And then that translates to the people you talk to.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I've never really thought about it, but I think that is true. Yeah,
Wow. So I'll put a link in the description to the company, if that's okay.
sure.
And yeah, if anybody wants to reach out and ask you any questions, about any of this very broad conversation that we had, they should, contact you through the website, through the company.
Yeah, definitely. That website goes directly to my email. So, yeah, love hearing from folks.
Dave, thanks so much for answering my questions and kind of demystifying a little bit of what artist relations is and your role in it and everything that you're doing. I think it's super cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fun talking about it. It's actually really helpful for me too, just to vocalize some of it like this so it's not all just stuck up in my head.
I understand that for sure. Well, thanks again, Dave. You take care and we'll talk again.
All right, man. Thank you.